Today we're going to talk about perfectionism and about why your perfectionism is probably ruining your writing and certainly hindering your author career. Perfectionism is a really dangerous thing for creatives. At the same time, it leads to some of the greatest work we ever do. You know, an exacting standard is one of the hallmarks of a genius level creative. Almost every single creative who has ever had a tremendous impact upon the world with their art has had a kind of perfectionism that has driven them to extremes to perfect or to master their art. That's not the kind of perfectionism that I'm talking about. See, when we talk about perfectionism, really there are two different things that we're talking about, but we often just lump them together. The two kinds of perfectionism are an exacting standard for the quality of what you're doing and a fear of failure. We want the first, this intense drive towards perfecting our art. We want that kind of perfectionism. But we do not want the other kind of perfectionism, which is sadly a lot more common, which is simply the fear of failure. There's a lot of research about people who are masters of their craft or geniuses, and all of it suggests that geniuses are made rather than born. That is to say, geniuses don't just appear out of the ether. Instead, they're created from a particular mix of circumstances and internal drives. And this intense desire to perfect their craft, to master the entirety of their field, to move to the end of what is known and forge beyond, that is a kind of perfectionism that we should all want to pursue. Because at the end of the day, all that is curiosity. It's answering the question, what's over the horizon? What's next? What do I not know in this situation? How can I do this better or more efficiently? How can I react quicker? How can I make something that's more beautiful? How can I engage people in a stronger way? Curiosity lies at the core of all of those questions. And that's a kind of perfectionism that we actually want. But what we're talking about in the video today is the other kind of perfectionism. The perfectionism that says, if I can't do this right the first time, then I'm just not going to do it. And that is a perfectionism born out of fear. That is a detriment to any creative. And so as we pursue our career as an author, we really want to watch for the places where we are allowing that kind of negative perfectionism to dictate our actions. And if you're a writer, you have certainly experienced this. That moment when your heart clenches when somebody reads your work. And the reality is that you experience this at all levels. You know, even if you have written a bunch of books and you've published them and you are successful by typical metrics, a fan coming up to talk to you about your books might produce that same heart clench. Ooh, I'm not sure how this person feels about my work. And all of a sudden I get nervous because maybe they don't like it. Or maybe I released a new book and they didn't like it as much. Or any number of other things that could lead to this sort of fear manifesting. This sort of perfectionism is no good, right? It's a kind of poison for your author career. Today I want to talk about 3 ways that your perfectionism is literally ruining your writing. So the first is that this kind of perfectionism, this sort of narrowed focus, leads to getting trapped in what you might call a creative canyon. When you want something to be perfect, typically what you're going to do is you're going to have a standard in your mind, even if it's undefined, and you're going to push towards that standard. Well, the problem with that is that often the best parts of writing, the best parts of books, come from a completely unexpected connection or from an angle that we couldn't see when we set out to write. If you start with a preconceived notion of what perfect is for your story, for the book you're writing, then it becomes impossible to capture those serendipitous moments because you're so focused on getting to the end of the canyon that you never see the massive plains or the mountains that are outside of the canyon. When you're down in a canyon, all you can see are the canyon walls. And typically, your environment is always the same, right? If you're walking through a redstone canyon, well, all of the walls are red, right? It's just dirt everywhere. And so you walk through and that's all you can see. And you might have a destination in mind. You might be trying to get to the end of the canyon and you might be succeeding in that. But you're going to miss everything that's outside of it. And more often than not, what makes stories really magical are things from outside of the canyon that are pulled in. By fixating on what perfect looks like for your story, for your book, you're not going to be able to incorporate all of the magic that you would otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that you should go into every book blind, go into every book without having a clear sense of what you're trying to write or where you're trying to go. No, that's not the point. The point is that if you simply focus on what perfect looks like, you're just not going to be as creative. You're not going to be able to make the connections that'll bring wonder into your story. Because wonder lies at its core in what we don't know relative to what we do know. And so it's only in the gap that we find true wonder, which means that if you have this idea of what perfect is, then you by nature leave no gap, right? There's no room for surprise. There's no room for wonder. And that is a terrible, terrible place to be creatively. Then the second thing that this sort of toxic perfectionism really does to us is that it prevents us from seeking feedback. Because again, perfectionism in the negative sense is tied to fear. It's tied to a mismatch between our abilities and the expectation or the assumed expectation. Because often the expectation that we have as a perfectionist just doesn't actually exist. Like nobody else has that expectation. We just have that expectation. We expect something from ourselves. So a great example of this, which is honestly just kind of stupid, but bear with me here. So I write a lot and I try to write 10,000 words a day minimum. And occasionally I'll get stuck in this really stupid mindset where I'll say to myself, I don't have time to write 10,000 words today, so I'm going to write 0. I'm just not going to write any at all. I'm going to distract myself with other things to do because I can't write 10,000 words. Or I'll say to myself, I have time to write 10,000 words, but I just don't feel like I will be able to write 10,000 words. And so I'm just not going to write at all. And this is just such a dumb mindset to have, but it's based on this again, toxic sense of perfectionism, where if you can't do the thing perfectly the first time, you just don't even attempt it. I used to think that this was just me, like it was just something I did. But over the years, I've discovered that almost everybody operates like that on some level. But not only can perfectionism, keep you from even attempting in the first place, but it can prevent you from improving Because when we hold an absolute standard, which is, again, what this kind of perfectionism is, it's this absolute standard. When we hold that absolute standard, we often fear falling short, and that just leads us to inaction. And so it might stop you from getting feedback, the feedback that you need to improve. It might stop you from attempting in the first place. It might stop you from writing. It's going to act as this barrier that just sits in front of you and keeps you from moving forward. I talk so much on this channel about how important feedback is, right? And about how establishing a feedback loop and seeking out feedback is so important. When I look at authors who are successful versus authors who don't make it, one of the single greatest differences between those two groups of people that I've seen, and I've seen this over and over and over again, one of the single greatest differences is that people who succeed are aggressive about getting feedback. They not only take feedback, but they incorporate the feedback. They don't hold so tightly to this standard of creative perfection, right? That is entirely manifested out of their own mind. Writing is in some ways different than a lot of creative arts because there's more than just the person who creates involved. You also have readers, people who pick something up and have to exert effort in order to consume the art, right? It's different than a picture. If you paint a beautiful picture and you stick it on the wall, somebody can look at it and it takes essentially no effort to look at it. At the surface level, right? You can just glance at it and you can be like, oh, I like that. That's, that looks great. Or it's not really my style. I don't like it. Right? And you can make that snap judgment. With a book, in order to get any sort of sense of it, you have to exert effort. You have to read it, or at least some part of it. And because of that, because books by nature are this interaction between author and reader, it doesn't help for the author to hold, this absolute standard of what a good book is, because they're just never going to find any readers. Instead, being able to take feedback, being able to shift your target based on what readers actually like or want, that's one of the things that leads to long-term success. And then the final way that perfectionism is ruining your writing is that it prevents you from finishing. I have seen this so many times, man. An author who is just obsessing over a book as if that single book is the only one they're going to write in their career. That's not how being an author works. You keep writing books. And yes, you should make your book as good as you can. You should make your book, the best it can possibly be in that moment. But because people fear releasing content or releasing a story, releasing a book that isn't up to this imaginary standard in their mind or isn't as good as, other authors they read, they just never finish it. And they never take the first steps in this dream of being an author. At the end of the day, there is no use comparing yourself to other authors. You can only write your own books. You can't write their books. You can only write as best you can and try to improve. Every book you write should be better than the previous book you wrote. But worrying about whether it is perfect, worrying about whether it is, your greatest work is just not worthwhile. Perfectionism is very dangerous because it can just stop you from ever doing the thing. It can keep you from ever moving forward. More often than not, when we write a book and we're excited because we've written the best thing that we've ever written before, and we start to have that little doubt in our head, ooh, is this actually good? Is this, does it need to be improved? Where can I improve it? Where can I shift things around? Ooh, maybe that plot point wasn't as good as I thought, or maybe the twist wasn't as good as I thought. Spending time obsessing about fixing it is ultimately counterproductive. Instead, accept that you have written the best book you could write, learn your lessons from it, and go and write a better book. At the end of the day, editing and revising have diminishing returns. The thing you need to be doing is you need to be practicing writing. Editing and drafting are two completely different skills, which is why there are professional editors who are not authors. Endless revisions don't help us. We need to continue on and continue writing more books. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this video that there is another kind of perfectionism, right? There's a perfectionism that marks all great artists. And so some of you might be thinking, but Seth, how can you have that perfectionism as good and then, sit here for a video and tell me that perfectionism is bad? The difference between you and I and these geniuses that I'm talking about is time. Time and intention. The perfectionism that we see in them, that exacting standard, only exists because they have spent so much time mastering their craft. They have spent so much of their focus and intention in understanding the exacting standard of what they like. And they have refined this over a tremendous number of iterations. And so when you see a painter whose paintings are just so, or when you see a filmmaker whose films are just so, or when you read the work of a great novelist whose phrasing is just so, that exacting standard is born not out of thin air. It's not born out of an arbitrary standard, which is what our perfectionism usually is. Instead, it's been refined and polished over a really long time. I think we often get confused because we see, people who are just fantastic artists or fantastic writers, and we think to ourselves, man, I wish I could write like that. I wish I could draw like that. And you will be able to eventually, one day. But it takes time to get there. And the reason perfectionism is dangerous is because if you use their standard for yourself before you've done all of the work necessary to get to that level, it's just going to stop you from even doing it in the first place. That's my rant on perfectionism. I'm talking about perfectionism in large part because I feel like it has been kicking my butt recently. And so one of my goals is to just represent, as a full-time author, what this life is like. And this is one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot. How my perfectionism is keeping me from actually utilizing my full potential, actually writing books to the extent or the degree that I'm capable. As always, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you disagree or if you have questions. I'd love to chat about it. If you have other topics that you'd like me to cover, put those in the comments as well.